Yes. Hello. I'm Ross Gall. I am a double major in both the linguistics department and the German department, and I will be presenting on the tonology of Lamkang, which is a Tibeto-Burman language spoken in Northeast India.
Very good. The floor is yours.
Lamkang tonology, Ross Gall, Department of Linguistics, April 13th, 2021. In addition to vowels and consonants, tone is the focus of my presentation, and tone is a very intriguing aspect of languages. Well, Chinese uses a tonal system to determine lexical meaning or grammatical meaning. So in addition to vowels and consonants, the pitch helps determine lexical or grammatical meaning, and that change can be referred to as the pitch. And this is the tone. I look at how to measure pitch and characterize tone for the language. I'm specifically looking for words in the Lamkang language, which I will now tell you more about. My research question is the following. How can I best characterize the tone of a word? A, should I measure pitch across the word? B, should I measure the word only across the vowel? Or C, will the results be different? 3 questions. 1 result. All right, so some basic language information. Lamkang, or known by its International Standardization Organization Code, LMK, is a Tibeto-Burman language spoken in the Chandel district of Manipur, which is a state in northeastern India. And to the right is a map in the native language of Manipur, Meitei as it's called. And so this is the Myanmar border, but this right here, this area, which I'm highlighting with my mouse, is the Chandel district where the Lamkang speakers have their home. It's from, and as stated before, the Lamkang languages of the Tibeto-Burman language family. The South Central branch, more specifically. Some speakers are in diaspora, and it is endangered with a total of fewer than 10,000 speakers, so lesser than or equal to if a little comparison floats anyone's boat. A major source of the data would be word lists that were put together from a number of sources, including traditional narratives. Many of these were recorded in the linguistics department soundproof booth, in 2016 with native speaker Sumshot Kular. These word lists and audio files are available in the Coursal archive, that stands for Computational Resources of South Asian Languages. But from the word lists used, there were only minimal pairs. Words which are similar, or exactly the same rather, but only different in pitch. And they're shown on the next slide. Some of the minimal pairs which are used will be, or are as follows. Cot, which translates to shoot. Got, a thorny fern, as in a fern with a lot of thorns on it. Klut, to enter. Klut, to spend. And please note here that a rising tone is indicated by an accent mark. So then, methodology, a program known as, I used to answer my question about how to best measure and characterize tone. I did the following. I used a program called Prot to conduct pitch and acoustics analysis. And the screenshot of Prot is to the right. And with Prot, I created a spectral analysis in hertz of each word in a set of minimal pairs. I recorded the hertz values for the central blue line, which is the pitch trajectory on the spectrogram. I gathered values for the initial, mid, and final parts of the full word. And then I compared the results for initial, mid, and final values of the tone in hertz for just the vowel on its own, as shown here. And I analyzed the comparison to see if these are the same or different. Some of the observations of pitch which were made. So on the words themselves, cot, level upon rise, it's a level tone structure overall. Upon rise starts high, lowers in transition to mid stage, then rises up again in hertz. Cot, a thorny fern, is a falling tone structure overall. It falls at initial, then continues to fall even further. Klut, to enter, is a level tone structure overall. It falls at transition from initial to mid, then falls ever so slightly a little bit. Then Klut, to spend, is a falling tone overall, but then it falls at transition from initial to mid, then falls ever so slightly. Whereas on the vowels themselves, a level tone can be observed for cot, to shoot, in which it rises at the initial, falls slightly at the mid and stage, and then rises up at the final. Cot, a thorny fern, rises at the initial, is a falling tone structure overall, and rises at the initial, lowers drastically at mid stage, and then falls further at the final stage. Klut, to enter, is level. It rises at the transition stage from initial to mid, then falls ever so slightly, and is a level tonal structure overall. I apologize profusely for my errors. Klut, to spend, is a falling tone structure overall that rises in transition from initial to mid and then lowers drastically. Here are the measurements for all my data that was collected. All right, so what can be determined from this is that tone cannot be determined solely from one value alone. Thus, understanding the trajectory of a pitch over the vowel is important for understanding how minimal pairs are differentiated. As far as future work is concerned, there will likely be studies done on the trajectory of tone over syllables of different shapes. And CV, just briefly for anyone who's curious, this means consonant, vowel, as in, so consonant, consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, just basic syllabic structure has to be analyzed, and then also the trajectory of tone for different vowels, or the trajectory of tone for the same vowels in different syntactic environments, such as a book or the red book. Books are fun. And it is with much thanks to the following that I give my gratitude. Sum Shot Kular, Dr. Shobana Chelia, Dr. Willem de Roos, Evelyn Blair, Marty Heaton, and the Coursal database. Those are my references. Thank you.
Well, that very good indeed. That was terrific. And the way I'm going to moderate Q&A is just for the sake of allowing each student to get through their presentations. At this moment, we can entertain 2 questions or comments. Doesn't have to be a question, it can be a comment. And then we'll move on to the next speaker, but time allowing, at the end, our audience can come back, and if we have time to fill, we'll fill the hour with more questions. So would anybody at this point like to make a comment or a question other than, no, I'll repeat it. Well done, Ross, very well done. But would anybody like to add something to that?
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Hi, Ross. Great job. Very interesting data. I was wondering whether you have looked at other vowels, minimal pairs that include other vowels as well. You had like a back vowel, right? And you had, I don't know what the properties of is, right, in Lamkang, whether it is, you know, low back or low central vowel. But I was wondering whether you have looked at high front vowels, for example, and see how pitch there works.
Thank you for the comment and question, Dr. Kapitanjani. I have not seen much else except what is done at the well, the vowels themselves are, it's just simple script A, script U, oo. It's very simple, but also one has to take into account the fact that what with this pandemic and all, there wasn't much time to go into further detail as far as the vowels were concerned. I mean, there was a list of 4,000 words, so going ever so slowly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Do we have another comment or question? Well, in that case, I'll make one comment. And this will depart from the immediacy of your presentation, but it does relate. I couldn't help but think during your presentation of an utterance of Henry James when he was commenting on one of the characters he created, and I believe it was in a letter to somebody. And he remarked, it wasn't what she said that surprised me. It was the tone of what she said that surprised me. And that has stuck in my brain as such a brilliant remark about creativity. And I know that at some level that relates to your studies in tonality. Well, what a great job. And if we have time, we'll come back to you. But for the moment, we're going to move on to Erin Moore. And either Erin will unmute herself or Ms. Adele will do that. And the floor is yours for the preliminary 10 minutes, Erin.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Erin. I'm an English and anthropology double major. My project is in English, and it's called Speaking in Welsh, the Representation of Wales and Welsh. So for those who aren't familiar with Henrietta, it's just referring to the cycle of either 4 or 8 of the history plays by William Shakespeare. In total, they cover like the dynasty, I guess, from the second. I'm focusing on 3 of the 4 plays in this Iliad. So Richard II, Henry IV Part 1, and Henry V. I didn't have a super defined research question going in. I'm really interested in the representation of Wales and speech in these plays after reading Richard II and Henry IV Part 1 in my Shakespeare class, and there's some really interesting moments of like tensions in those plays. First, really briefly, I want to kind of contextualize my project in like Shakespeare studies and post-colonial study of Shakespeare. That's like Shakespeare in general is a huge field, and then post-colonial Shakespeare studies have like really blossomed in the last couple decades. There's a lot of focus on adaptation and reception of Shakespeare, and also these are like the plays that have kind of very obvious colonial subtext, like Othello, for example. But that kind of idea of what is obviously colonial is informed by our modern understandings of what coloniality looks like. And Ireland, Scotland, and Wales were all nations that were also by the English. Those people viewed as racially distinct from the English in the early modern period. So it's important to look at those places kind of in the larger context of post-colonial studies of Shakespeare, especially because around the time that Shakespeare was writing, the English were kind of having to reconceptualize their notions of race as they started to expand into like what looks more like modern colonialism. And so like the precedent by like these early like racial, ethnic, linguistic categorizations is really important. And then Wales in particular tends to be understudied, even looking at like Ireland, Scotland, and Wales in Shakespeare. Willie Maley, who's written a lot on Shakespeare, proposes that this is basically because Ireland and Scotland continue to have relationships with England that are very troubled in ways that are familiar to like modern readers, whereas Wales kind of flies are. Ironic because Wales is actually a very common setting in Shakespeare, about as common as like contemporary Italy was, and yet it still is sort of understudied. So I'm gonna jump right in and try and skim through like the bird's eye view of my analysis. There's a lot of like other elements and threads I would love to talk about, but we can save that for the Q&A. In Richard II, language in both Welsh and English are very like powerful in an almost like supernatural way, I guess you could say. This passage that I have here on the slide is from about halfway through the play, where the balance of power in England is starting to shift away from Richard II towards Bolingbroke. And Ireland, the king has been away in Ireland fighting these wars, and his like delayed return to England seems to confirm like these prophecies and series of which leads the Welsh to abandon him and go to Bolingbroke. Eventually leads Richard II's deposition as king. So in this play, kind of like the overarching thing I want to argue is that Welsh has this very outsized influence on the plot and the outcome of Bolingbroke's challenge to the English throne. But textually, it only appears in this very small moment. And we don't even get to see like prophecies that are spoken by these Welsh people. This is just reported secondhand by a Welsh captain. Moving on to Henry IV Part 1. In this play, Welsh kind of explodes into like the bigger picture. There's a lot of moments where Welsh or Welsh speakers appear, and there's a lot of like tension and conflict in Welsh and English and the speakers of the two languages. This passage, which continues onto the next slide, kind of depicts the language barrier that exists between Mortimer, who's an English lord, and his wife, who's the daughter of the Welsh Queen Glendower. And this is kind of like the key moment that really got me interested in this topic, is that there's these stage directions that refer to Lady Mortimer speaking Welsh on stage in English, but this isn't scripted out for us, so we don't have like a clear idea of what is said. Let me go to my next, there we go. And also what this scene taps into, and again, I can come back to this in Q&A if needed. There's kind of this thread that runs throughout the encounters with Welsh, and particularly, which is the kind of emasculating power that Welsh and Welsh women have. Hotspur is also present for this whole exchange and responds like very mockingly to Mortimer's interactions with his wife. And we also see that Mortimer would respond in kind to his wife's tears, but doesn't because of some shame that he feels. I'm gonna move on to Henry V, which is the final play I'm gonna be talking about. And so kind of to recap like this trajectory, and Richard II, like Welsh is very small, plays a small role like textually, but has a really, I would say, a large influence on the plot. And then coming into Henry IV Part 1, it plays like this really major role. And it's kind of diminished again here in Henry V. There's a character called Llewellyn who's a captain in the English army. And there's actually an Irish, a Welsh, a Scottish, and an English captain kind of representing these four parts of Great Britain. And they're all subsumed into like this larger army, which is fighting a war abroad in France, which seems to kind of paint an image that the British Isles have been kind of united under like a common flag. And Llewellyn is also kind of this comic relief character, which again seems to kind of diminish. Glendower in the previous play is a very powerful figure, and he's a king essentially. And so Llewellyn's been like demoted to the status of captain. And he also speaks with a Welsh accent, and that's represented like in the text of the play, which again, comparing where there's no Welsh in Richard II on the page. And then in Henry IV Part 1, we have Welsh being spoken on stage, represented in the text. Shakespeare kind of attempt to textually represent that accent, but it's very like inconsistent and arguably inaccurate in the way it's like written. And sorry, I lost my train of thought for a moment. So basically what comes out of this play is that the character of Llewellyn is sort of partially assimilated into like English society, which I argue is very revealing of this subtext of ongoing colonization, even though kind of the obvious text of the play would seem to suggest Ireland, Scotland, and Wales have all been absorbed into the English nation. So just to conclude and sum up before my time is up, I'm in my paper, I argued that Welsh follows this very particular trajectory where it's power, and Richard II, where it's extremely influential, is like diminished over the course of the tetralogy. And the second, to Henry IV, where it does provoke all these sort of tensions and crisis. Those conflicts are kind of at least overtly subjugated in Henry V. Sorry, again, I lost the phrase I was about to say. But yeah, there's a lot of things that I would love to talk more about, and like things I didn't have the chance to explore in this paper, but that's what I have.
Well, that was just splendid. So congratulations to you. So for the moment, do we have a couple of questions? Well, while my colleagues, students, and faculty are deliberating, let me start it off with one question for you. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that, and I'll here quote you, the speech of non-English characters contributes to a trajectory of colonial assimilation and disempowerment of language, which spans the tetralogy. Now, my question is, if this is indeed the case, and it appears to be, is is that because Shakespeare is exposing that colonial assimilation, or because Shakespeare is perpetuating it in an unthinking ideology?
That's a really good question. I don't know that I have a definitive answer, obviously.
Well, what would be your
Mhm.
gut response?
Yeah, I'm trying to sort it out. This is like kind of like what the reception of this performance would have been. It's something that I would have loved to explore more, but again, like time constraints prevented me from getting into that. I think I want to say that I don't know, I feel like it's a cop-out, but I feel like it's a little bit of both. I'm leaning towards saying that it's probably exposing this colonial process in some, just because I think that that moment of Welsh being spoken on stage in Henry IV Part 1 was, it just seems, and this may have been like contradicted by historical evidence, which I have not encountered, but like it seems like such a powerful moment, especially in context of like the not assimilation, what was for the Acts of Union that kind of incorporated Wales into England as a principality, I think is the term, and did kind of, I think at that point, like constraints have been placed on like the speaking of the language. So I lean towards it being kind of an expose of that process, but I think it is like very ambivalent, especially because a lot of the reading I did talked about how there's a lot of ideas about Henry V being a very like patriotic play, and it's representing this moment where England is entering into war against France and is successful and victorious. And I think that the character of Llewellyn continuing to kind of come into conflict with the English characters, even at the end of that play, kind of undercuts that victory of the English. I don't know if that was.
Oh no, I think that was a very brilliant response to a question that's a pretty hot topic of debate in the field these days. Do we have any other? Do we have one more? Yes, Shavana, Dr. Chiala, please.
Yeah, please. So thank you for your presentation, Erin. That was very interesting. You might be interested that there's a dissertation that came out of the English department by Kalevani Mutea, which I happen to have directed. It has to do with the use of I dialect in literature by Indian authors writing in English, but it's the same genre of what you're talking about, which is talking about subjugation of a class of people through representation of their language, through, and it turned out that it was usually the buffoons and the losers, who spoke with a strong Indian dialect features. And so she kind of turns that around and looks at some of the later writing by Pakistani authors who are really pulling those people up by making, that accent be not of the losers, but of the winners and of the heroes. So anyway, great work. And how cool that there's always something cool new to say about Shakespeare. Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Well, again, thank you, Erin. Terrific presentation. And now we will hear from Justin. Justin, the floor is yours for the next 10 minutes.
Sounds good. Let's see. All right. So this is the synonym spectrum. And this is something that I'm doing for my honors thesis in the Department of Linguistics. Let me see if I can't. There we go. So in short, what I've done is I've used a semantic differential survey that I administered to native English speakers 18 years or older to find out if we share generalized perceptions of synonymy, both in and out of context. Because it'd be one thing to say that we all agree on, oh yeah, just like we say one word, this is how we all feel about it. But it's sort of another thing to look at how we feel about those same words whenever we actually apply context to it. what I found is that that is indeed true. And I'll show patterns in my data analysis that show the systematic lines of those. And finding that, I then applied some principles found in previous literature on how to model that, so that maybe we might be able to go forward in artificial intelligences and model and code this gradient or spectrum of perceptions for the future. In order to start off, we need to understand what exactly is a synonym. A synonym is kind of a loosely and rather ill-defined thing that you'll find if you look into it. And some of the meanings that I have listed above are pretty preliminary explanations. So words that have the same meaning, I am happy with my purchase, maybe as opposed to I'm satisfied with my purchase. As you can see, given that example, they aren't quite the same thing. So there's still some semblance of difference there. You couldn't really necessarily say that they're words that are interchangeable either, because say you want to say face a daunting task, but you wouldn't say face a daunting job. That's not quite interchangeable at all. And so in essence, what we find is that absolute synonymy is effectively relegated to just dialectical or technical difference, such as the difference between underwear and pants in American and British English, or distitious and two-ranked being one technical and one casual. All this to say is that there's really no such thing as a real synonym, but more accurately, we might call them near synonyms. So we want to know, or what I wanted to know was, do we share perceptions of these ill-defined things that we call synonyms? According to Schreier in his work, he says something rather basic, that you might be inclined to believe that, oh, synonymy is something that we all tend to feel generally different about, given the context, person to person, external factors. But according to Fakhruddinov, he says that you can identify the distinctions of synonyms and how people use synonyms given their communicative purpose. And that's the idea that guided all my work. And if he is correct, then of course we would be able to find these generalized perceptions both in and out of context across the majority of native speakers. In order to study this, two principles that we have to establish are that of the prototypical form and understanding the application of sameness and difference. Essentially, what a prototypical form is, it's a neutral base word that a cluster of different near synonyms all kind of refer to. In example 18 that I have up there, you notice that slender, slim, and skinny, all being synonymous, they scale to the degree of thinness, and thin is a rather generic, basic word that you might consider the prototypical form. And given that, you can apply the degree of sameness and difference across slender, slim, and skinny, depending on their proximity or sameness or even degree of difference. So as in example 17 above, you may notice or feel that the word skinny might be a bit more negative or pejorative as opposed to its supposed synonyms or near synonyms, rather, slim or slender. And understanding the degrees to which all these words that are supposed to be similar are different is very key in understanding and coding all these things. In order to categorize synonyms, it'd be rather inappropriate to assume that all synonyms are different and similar in a lot of the same ways, but a lot of the previous literature divides synonymy into 4 distinct categories of how they, or dimensions of variation as they call it, and how they are synonymous. We have denotational, structural, stylistic, and expressive. Denotational, tends to be the difference between like error and mistake. Structural being more akin to what I had said earlier with why you can't say face a daunting job, but you can say face a daunting task. And you have stylistic such as the difference between inebriated and drunk, and expressive, much like skinny, slim, slender, and thinness. What I focused on in particular, in order to keep things rather concise, were the categories of stylistic and expressive. And in each individual category, you find even further semantic distinctions of how they kind of scale to one another. Yeah, such as in stylistic, you have the formality of something, you have the force, intensity, less intensity of something, the concreteness of how a particular word applies to a situation, or floridity, which is a fun one, tenebrous as opposed to dark, or familiarity even. And then you have expressive with expressed attitude and emotive, like you'd be more inclined to say daddy, or maybe if you're closer with your father, if you have a very particular sort of relationship, as opposed to what the word father tends to hold. And to be even more focused, the two that are italicized, the scale of force, intensity to less intensity, and the expressed attitude of negative to positive, those are the particular categories that I decided to focus on to represent the study. All that considering, what the primary purpose of this study that I had done is to find how can we model these things for future study in artificial intelligence. According to Fakhruddinov, there is a principle that we can apply called the synonymic row. And what this is a system-based organization of words that have a dominant word to the far left, and the words that are further to the right tend to be those with the greatest distinction from that dominant word. And example 5 right there is kind of an instance of what that may look like according to Fakhruddinov. What he doesn't consider, however, is another principle that Edmonds and Hurst use, and that's the idea of granularity. And that's the level of detail that one might find, one might find in a particular cluster of words. It's different from specificity, of course, because that refers to concepts as opposed to individual synonyms. So my research questions, that all to say, is that one, is there an identifiable consensus? Do we all feel the same way about different synonyms and words? And if that is true, what are the patterns of that? And once we recognize and identify those patterns, we can then go on to model those patterns. In order to select these words, I used Rogit's digital version of Rogit's dictionary, and selected only the top 20% of words that could be found in the corpus of contemporary American English. That is to account for any words that might not be known by speakers. And this is a general layout of what those questions look like, scaled to positive and negative in one section, intense to less intense in another, both in and out of context. And of course, as I had said before, overall, we find that this is the case. In this graph in particular, we see that for the most part, yeah, we do share perceptions, because the higher and more distinct a point is, that shows that, wow, you know, we really do feel that way for the most part. And even in the instance of courageous over here, while the synonyms themselves may be more inclined in one direction across the spectrum, what's more important and what kind of the focus of my study is that they're all generally unanimous, and they are directed in this very particular positive direction as opposed to negative. Oh, yes, for sure. All this kind of shows the same thing, both in and out of context. We see that the patterns are generally the same. And considering that they are the same, we can then account for granularity by showing the degrees of similarity and sameness. We see that some points are lower than others, even though they might be in the same perceptive category. And then we can model that. And below are my own individual models of an updated synonymic row accounting for that granularity of sameness and difference. And those are really all my conclusions. And that's important for an array of reasons. Oh, my bad.
Well, that was terrific. Let's give Justin a round of applause there. Do we have a question or two at this time?
Well, I could ask a question. So Justin, do you think that the results would be different depending on the ages of the people that were interviewed, as if some of these words may take on a different meaning for different age groups?
It's possible. That's a very interesting question. I suppose you would mean like if perceptions might change over time then. That's a very good question. That's very possible. I suppose it is. In my study, I just asked for people 18 and over. I hadn't really thought that the age might impact that. I would be inclined to believe that might be the case, though.
Yeah, some of them are colloquially used as something that might have a pejorative or negative meaning for an older person might be,
Mm-hmm.
Exactly, Shobana. Yeah, you're right. Like, think about skinny, right? How in younger generations, I don't think that this will have a negative, connotation, right? It will be a compliment, actually. So I think Justin has the data that he needs actually to perform an analysis based on age and how, like the different perceptions differ or are similar across different age groups. I think, Justin, you have different responses that you can look at how, like age compares and contrasts in terms of perceptions.
Well, I didn't ask for anyone's specific age. All I had was a requirement that, so you're 18.
Okay. So on the survey, you didn't have, okay, you didn't ask for the age of the participant. Okay. Okay. Yeah. My bad then.
Yeah. No, that would be interesting and very possible to do.
Yeah, you have your survey ready so you can run it, and have a question about age there so that you have this variable measured as well. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, if I may follow up on my colleagues' really astute observations, in a slightly different medium. Now, you spoke of near synonyms, you spoke of levels of detail, and then you asked the question, which my colleagues just addressed, do we all feel the same way about a synonym and there can be age variables? So skipping over to a different medium, what are your feelings if you can apply all of your learning about synonyms to the current use, as I'm seeing among the student body, of emojis? What does a linguistically educated student like you feel about the assumption that if somebody just projects an emoji on the screen, that we're all going to get it? We're all going to feel the same way. What would you, if you can just hop over to that different medium for a moment, as a linguist, how would you respond to the current use of emojis? And I must confess limited knowledge about that. I've never myself used one, except when I was typing too fast on one occasion. One of them sprung up, and I hope that would never happen again. But anyway, so what would be your response to emojis?
My inclination would be to think that, of course, in my own personal usage of emojis, I would say that it may be, because emojis, of course, are a bit more generalized. They're just images. They don't really say or convey any like necessarily nuanced idea. Though so for that reason, I would think that while it might convey a rather general idea, so like say a laughing emoji, everyone might get the same feeling of, oh, haha, that's pretty funny, or this is the intention. But as far as the level of detail or nuance, I don't think that would really be able to be conveyed with an emoji.
Okay, good response. So we do have about 10 minutes left. And now let me invite anybody to address a question to any of our three panelists today, or just to make a general comment.
I have a question for Erin. That was, did Shakespeare support indigenous libertarianism or indigenous self-determination for the Welsh people through his work?
So I think that like historically it's going to be very hard to say like exactly what his political stance was. I think that there's a lot of interesting arguments that have been made. I know I came across something in my reading that was basically talking about like the way that we Shakespeare the Bard, which is a Welsh term, and talking about like how he potentially had like Welsh ancestry and whether or not that influenced his position. I think that ultimately like it's very ambivalent, and you also have to take into account that he's writing these plays sometimes like under patronage, so like there's kind of like balancing the political opinions of the person who's funding you versus your own political opinions. So I don't have a definitive answer. I think it's definitely like this complex, ambiguous thing that's going on, because there's also discussions around like whether or not there were Welsh speaking or actually Welsh native actors like in Shakespeare's companies. Like there's a lot of different things that can be to that. That wasn't a super straightforward answer. I'm sorry.
Other questions? Thank you for that response. Great question. Very nice response. Well, here's a question for our three panelists today. We go into, as we all know from having done research, we go in with an idea of what might be, whether one wants to call that a hypothesis or a sense of what we stand to discover. But we're all at some point, regardless of our field of study, we're all surprised by something. And that surprise can often take us off track by a half a year or more. I would just ask, were any of you surprised? And what was the nature of that surprise?
I was definitely surprised by, so I think I mentioned I read Richard II and Henry IV Part 1 in a Shakespeare course. And so in both of those plays, I was like really interested in like these moments where Welsh speakers and like there's these really interesting tensions and stuff. And so going into this project, I thought that like the conclusion I would come to would be that this is like a very much like Shakespeare promoting Welsh identity in the Welsh language. And then I read Henry, which kind of took me completely in a different direction because it does very much change the dynamic. Because again, like these characters are like assimilated into this idea of England as a single, like all-encompassing nation. So that was kind of the surprising thing for me, was once I got into Henry V, I was like, oh, this totally changes where I thought I was going.
That was a great surprise. Did we have other surprises among our panelists?
For me, something when I initially was posed the question that every student going for their bachelor's degree has to question is, what am I going to do for my thesis? And initially, I just thought, what's the easiest? What's in semantics? Semantics is fun, and it seems like it's rather easy. What I was kind of surprised by is that not only is it not necessarily easy, but it's fascinating. I think my greatest surprise was actually discovering how genuinely excited I became as I kept reading more and more about it, to the point that now that's the field that I'm really like wanting to pursue. And that was what my surprise was in my pursuit of this project.
A personal passion is a great surprise. That's wonderful. Ross, did you have a moment of surprise?
Oh, yes, I did. I was personally surprised to find that indigenous language is very much a part of not only identity, but for the relevance of my response, it was very much doing the work on the Lamkang language allowed me to better understand how tone is not only just oh, you're talking like this, oh, I'm shouting, oh, or oh, I'm sad, I don't want to do this anymore, that sort of thing. How pitch of mood equates to pitch of just a tonal language specifically. That was an interesting, I'll say, disconnect, for lack of better phrase, to kind of come to grips with in the grand scheme of things, or the long run. But who's to say that tone languages or tonal languages don't have mood? I mean, they do, obviously, but tone is something so integral to their linguistic frame of reference and identity, just as a language community, a community of practice. It's so integral. Seeing all these connections helps to better define how one group or one area of the world, well, not as a whole, I'm not trying to make a generalization, mind you, I'm just saying that it was surprising to find that tone is very much not just something of pitch and music. It's also part of language. That's the biggest surprise.
Well, and I think that that surprise really helps you and others when they're surprised come to understand better the complexity of the contribution that they stand to make across the disciplines. So what I'd like to do is to say that I'm not surprised by the excellence of these presentations. And truly, what a pleasure it is to hear such young people speaking with such insight and authority about such complex topics, and how we are here witnessing the educators of tomorrow. But at the same time, we've been fortunate enough to have with us today the educators of today who have guided these students and who have imparted to them the craft of research. So to all concerned, hearty congratulations, and thank you for having joined us for this wonderful session. And thank you, Ms. Adele, for having been so central to having all of this cohere electronically. So with appreciation to all, it's been great having you here today.
Thank you for the great event, for showcasing our students' research. We appreciate that.
Absolutely. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Good job, everyone. Bye, guys.